Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm talking to Melina Palmer. Melina is a fellow podcast host who presents the Brainy Business podcast, in which she explores behavioural science concepts and relates them to business. Her main focus is on sales, helping her podcast listeners and clients understand the small changes that can make a big difference in areas like pricing, branding, and marketing. She helps clients deliver messages that are brain-friendly to increase customer engagement. My interest in having her on the Human Risk podcast is that what she uses from a sales perspective can also be used to manage human risk. After all, whether you're influencing customers to buy from you or employees to follow compliance procedures, it's all about influencing people. Experts like Melina, who can talk knowledgeably about behavioural science in an easily understandable manner, are what this show is all about. Not only that, but her Brainy Business podcast is one you should absolutely check out. And what better way to learn about it than to hear from the presenter herself? Melina has a really infectious energy, and I think you're going to enjoy hearing from her. So please enjoy my discussion with Melina Palmer. So Melina, host of the Brainy Business podcast, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
My absolute pleasure. And look, I know many of my listeners will have heard you and will come on and talk about the podcast. But what I would love to do is to talk a little bit about you and discover how you got into behavioral science and what fascinates you about it.
Absolutely. So I got my undergrad in business administration marketing. And when I was in just like last class, there was, one paragraph, one section of one book that had this little tiny tidbit about psychology of buying behavior. And I was just hooked. I was fascinated and amazed right then. And I knew at that point, I started to say, when I go back and I get a master's, I want to get it in this. I knew I didn't want an MBA, not anything against that for those who have them, but I knew it wasn't the right fit for me. And I spent the better part of a decade looking for programs in what I was calling behavioral psychology. But I was checking with business schools, things like that, and just nothing existed. Everybody said there wasn't a program in that. And, I could create my own if I wanted to. And pay them, of course.
Teach yourself. You're right. Yeah.
And so I said, well, as appealing as it is to pay you to teach myself, I think I will not do that. So I started working at a credit union, ran a marketing department there. I had been an advertising agency before that. And then I was in this innovative program for credit unions in the States and Canada. And they brought in some people from the Center for Advanced Hindsight from Duke University, which is Dan Ariely's group. For anyone who's not familiar, he's one of the leaders in the field. And I found, this is it. This is what I've been looking for all of this time. And so found out it was called behavioral economics and jumped right in and got my master's and moved into the whole world of behavioral science.
Wow. I mean, landing with Dan Ariely's gang is not a bad place to start in this piece. I can think of worse entry points.
Exactly. I have had the honor of having a call with Dan when I was doing my own research project for my master's. I was basing it on some research that he and his team had done out of Kenya. And I've always been the person who sends the email, does the thing, asks the question, raises your hand, where it's like, what's the worst that could happen? Someone says no, and then, or you never hear back. And so I reached out and Dan agreed to have a phone call with me. I got 30 minutes, I think, of his very valuable time to talk about that research project. And so, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Wow. That's pretty cool. And there's something I like in the way that you articulate your journey, because there is this sort of anti-orthodoxy, challenging of perceived ways of thinking and doing things that runs, I think, across anybody's career who's in this space, purely because it's a very young discipline.
Podcasting or behavioral economics or both.
Both, I guess. Right. But no, both. But which is interesting. I hadn't thought about the podcasting piece. So that then kind of sparks the fire. Where do we go from there after you've kind of got your master's? And
it's exciting because there are umpteen million ways to go with it at this point. And I have pretty much just left myself open to whatever may come tomorrow. And what I have found through this journey, so when I left my corporate, credit unions aren't super corporate, but I like to say corporate job, to start my consultancy, it was at the same time, or I guess go full time into consulting was at the same time that I was starting my master's. It all just sort of worked out so I could really focus my energy there. And I knew that I was early in the field of behavioral economics, but I had no idea just how early I was. And I figured there were going to be, several dozen people that were already in this business and marketing and brand strategy and behavioral science and how it came together. And I was going to be, 24, 25 down on the list. Yeah. And as I got into it and was seeing what was around, it was really just very, very academic still. And it still is today. It's moving a little bit forward. But then I realized it was time to start the podcast and really focus on the business space, and just the best decision I ever could have made. And so I have had downloads in over 150 countries. I have people all the time that I'll get either, someone sending an email or reaching out on LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook and saying, I'm in South Africa or India or Australia, and I love your podcast, and thank you for this, and asking questions and how it might apply in various business examples and how to further studies. And I've gotten big corporate clients out of it. It's just sort of waiting for the next amazing big thing that's going to happen and being open to the possibilities of the world. So I have no idea what even the next couple months will look like. And I do enjoy the excitement of that, I guess.
That's amazing. And look, for any listeners that haven't listened to it, it clearly comes highly recommended, because I tend not to invite people on whose output I don't think is worth my listeners hearing or reading. And in your case, it's like I don't know, I'm not even sure how to describe it, so I'm probably going to ask you to do that in a second, but it's like this super engaging, really fun vibe that you have on your podcast, backed by supremely, interesting, well-researched content. And it's this lovely combination, I think, of sort of friendly approach, but you get something substantive out of it. Was that the kind of, is that the intention?
Yes, definitely. I appreciate that. I think that is I love to hear how people who listen to it would explain it versus just what I think it is. Perception is reality. So, right. But that is very much what I have intended with the show. And people can see too, that so I end every episode, and all of my email signature and everything is with this Be Thoughtful. And I have a membership group called the Be Thoughtful Revolution. It's all this Be Thoughtful messaging. And I was very thoughtful and intentional in even creating the logo for my business, where it's a rocket ship, and that the smoke underneath it while it's shooting up is actually shaped like a brain. And the fonts I use are a little bit playful and interesting, just to make it feel approachable in a subject that could be very heavy. And for a lot of the other content that is out there, and the academic journals and all the things that I get to read and then bring forward for people, it's just could be boring if not really thoughtful about the way to present it and making sure it's in a way that people can understand. And so I have made a commitment to the audience that I don't use a bunch of terms like standard deviation and variance and things like that in the episodes. I could talk to you about it if you had a question, but it doesn't have to be the meat of it, because people would tune out and not be interested. And the point for me is to take behavioral economics out of academia and into application. And if it's something that would make me bored and that I don't want to listen to, then I know the audience wouldn't want to either. And I actually listen to every single episode and have to hear myself talk for an hour every week. And if I don't still laugh at my own jokes, then it's not good enough.
But it never ceases to amaze me that people in the world produce output that they kind of think is dull, right? It's almost like the sort of approach you have at school where you've got a piece of homework to do and you can't stand the subject and you probably hate the teacher as well. And you kind of get it over and done with and you hand it in. And it's astonishing to me how many people still do that as adults. And I love the way you talk about these things, because you're literally going, I'm setting myself a super high bar, which is my own kind of tolerance and standards. And I think that's something that really comes across in the way that you approach it.
Well, thank you. I do get the feedback from people that they can tell that I'm enjoying the content. I'm very passionate and excited about it. And I think it's also, when people do reach out to me, because like I said, I get connection requests and things from people I've never met all the time now. And they will send a message and say, oh, I love the podcast and this was great. And instead of having the thank you, goodbye sort of response or not acknowledging it at all. I've had my husband said from very early on, was like, no matter how big it gets, just don't big time people, don't big time anybody. And so I always make it very intentional to ask what they were interested in, what other topics might they want, and hearing from listeners what they would like the podcast to be and concepts they might be interested in, and then giving them a shout out and say, hey, Christian asked about this. And so we're talking about it here, and here's a link back to him. I just, want to lift all boats as much as I can and keep it engaging and interesting.
And I was going to have a go at describing your podcast, but I figure there's a better way to do this, which is to get you to describe it. So for people that haven't listened, what can they expect?
So there are now 91 episodes of the podcast. It comes out weekly. And it is all about the psychology of why people buy. And over time, it has developed to be just about our brains. And what I have found is the most useful in helping people to understand how they can best communicate with others, either through their messaging of helping someone to see what products are best for them or services and get people to engage with a business, understanding your own brain and how that works is helpful, and then saying, and everyone else does this as well. And you can see that in other people, and understanding our biases and the best way to communicate, as well as helping with mindset blocks and things like that. And so there are some episodes that are very much digging in on a specific concept. So there's an episode on time discounting, an episode on scarcity, and it's talking about what it is, all the research behind it, and then how you can use that in your business. There are also episodes like the top 5 wording mistakes businesses make, where it kind of rounds into, or questions about goal setting and things. And then I'm pulling in the content to back that up along the way, but it's about a specific question that's being answered. And there are interviews that I'm starting to do now with people that are working in the field to understand either how they're applying the research or a book that they've written, or how the field is advancing and how to, again, use that in life and business.
One of the reasons I want to speak to podcasters in kind of loosely in my space is that by doing the podcast, you learn a heck of a lot. And so I'm always fascinated by the insights that you'll just pick up on the way. I mean, there'll be things that that kind of you confirm that you already knew, and we all know about confirmation bias, but then there'll be some other things that you probably didn't know much about, and it's an education process for you. And so, with that in mind, what are the sort of key things that have surprised you about the way the brain works?
I think it's that while it's not logical, and one of the things I would say just from early on, which was surprising to me, and something that I know that everybody, whether I'm doing public speaking or through the podcast, what people find to be the most surprising thing to learn is that 99% of all of our decisions are made on a subconscious level. And so your subconscious brain is running the show, and it makes its decisions based on rewards and what it knows has worked in the past. So your entire experience is based on past, not what is actually in front of you, unless you're, careful and able to understand how to then apply those rules. So we can't change the percentage of what is done in the conscious versus subconscious brain. There's just not enough processing power in the conscious to be able to do everything. But when you are aware and thoughtful of how the brain is going to be making decisions, because it uses these rules of thumb constantly in all these different areas, you can start to tweak and improve your own behavior as well as the way that you communicate with other people. And it doesn't actually have to be difficult, and that very small changes can make a significant difference. One of my all-time favorite studies is this one I call the Snickers study, which it had a one-word difference between two different end cap displays in a grocery store. One says Snickers bars, buy them for your freezer. The other one says Snickers bars, buy 18 for your freezer, which is a lot of Snickers and more than most people are buying at any given time. And as the person creating that message, if you were the marketing team, probably would not feel very comfortable with putting a number like 18 on an ad, because you'd say it's arbitrary and people are going to ask me to back it up and where it came from. And, them is unlimited and someone could get 100 Snickers bars. But what the difference actually is a 38% increase in sales when the number 18 was used instead of the word them. So exactly the same imagery, the word, font, colors, everything exactly the same. Just that one change made a really significant difference. And so there are just these little tweaks and points where you can improve what you're doing, and just showing that even if you're doing everything right, except for the one thing, if it's a very specific one thing that's wrong, it could be tanking something that could have been very successful otherwise.
And I mean, it's one of many examples, but I love it because it's many of the examples you get are, you kind of go, I see how that works.
Right.
And as you rightly point out, 18 sounds outrageous. And in the context of all kinds of reasons, it doesn't sound like a good idea to be going out and promoting at that level. And yet clearly that works. And I think that's a fascinating example of where we have to try counterintuitive stuff, because as you say, if you started with the premise of what number would it be, people would probably shy away from 18 because it sort of it feels a bit strange and it's
exorbitant.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, what the hell are they thinking? And yet even we see that sign, and sure, as you say, there will be some people who for whom that number is too low. Right. But for the average person, they're going to look at that and go, whoa, that is pretty big. And so I think that's a really interesting example of the way some of those processes work that kind of scares me slightly, right? Because it demonstrates quite how idiotic in some respects our brains are. And yet we're perfectly capable of doing really smart things as well. How do you square that?
Well, the helpful of understanding that some of these rules, so it'll be interesting. I'll have listeners reach out and say, I could tell they were trying to prime me and I got past it, but then the loss aversion got me in the end, and so it's fun to have. So it was like, I still bought it, but I was a little bit more aware in the process, on the way to that. And so I think it's knowing that while, again, it is often irrational in the way that we're making a choice, or it feels like it's irrational, but it's logical and you understand the way that the brain set up the rule. And so being able to understand what may happen. So this, that number 18 versus them situation, it's about, so the number isn't what actually matters in that case. It's the concept of anchoring and adjustment. So this is the same concept that where if cans of soup are labeled as 10 for $10, people will buy more, or 10 euro. People will buy more than if they're labeled as $1 or euro each, even though it's exactly the same thing. Right. It's just not the way that our brain sees it. And then also when you have limits on things, people will buy more. So if those same cans of soup had a limit of 12, people will buy more than if there's no limit at all, even though they could have bought the same number. It puts this kind of point in the brain. So just understanding the psychology of it and how the number can come into play. And that's one of the things I help my clients to understand, and where a number of 18 in one context is not enough in another context, and it would be too low versus too high. And so being able to see that, in the case of the word them, it's actually just a fancy word for zero in this case. And so you want to think, when you are talking about it consciously on a cognitive space, when you're creating the ad, you're coming up with all these reasons why it's good. But if it's them, the question is actually just this tiny reframe that happens where when it's the word them, the question is, do you want to buy Snickers bars? Whereas when it's the number 18, it's just this slight shift in your brain of how many do you want? And also you're more likely to notice that 18 and you kind of work your way down from there. So just knowing all that nuance and subtlety is important in the way that it's applied. And I try to explain that in all the episodes of the podcast. And then again, working with clients directly just to make sure that they're honing in on how that gets put into practice.
Right. And it's interesting when you were talking about, the idea of sort of you bank the fact that they're going to buy them and then it becomes a question of how many. It's the same trick that I do when I'm doing presentations and you kind of, you want, have you got any questions? And of course, if you start with have you got any questions, you're framing it in the context of you might not have any. Whereas if you say, what questions do you have? Exactly. A very subtle shift, suddenly it's permissible to ask questions. And I think it's those, as you say, it's those subtle shifts that I think can make such a big difference, which is where this stuff becomes super powerful. Clearly, you can also use it for doing bad things. And, there's a lot of criticism of this there. And you very quickly get into the territory of, well, it's all about manipulating people. What do you say to that sort of criticism?
Well, the thing is that there can be bad people or people making bad choices in any area or industry or whatever it is. I actually make a point on most episodes where I'm like, hey, let's use these powers for good, people. Like, I trust that you're going to be well-intentioned with the information that's here. But the thing about behavioral economics, and for those of us that are in the field, we know so Richard Thaler is one of the very big leaders in the industry. He won a Nobel Prize for his work in nudging. And that is where I think the line shows that we as behavioral scientists and in behavioral economics are very grounded in this importance of still having free choice. So if you are nudging someone to make a better choice, then that is still considered a part of behavioral science. When you are forcing someone and they don't have a choice, that's where you're getting into what we call a shove, instead of a nudge. Right. And that's outside of the field. And so what has been found with all of this research and understanding more about the brain is that the choice someone will make changes drastically based on the way that information is presented to them. And so to say that you want to present choices to help people make the choice they would have made anyway, in reality, the choice will change based on slight tweaks in context. And so a really great example of this is one that was in the book Nudge, and that it goes into the cafeterias in schools. And if you were to set kids loose and say they have as much money as they want and their parents will never know what they got and they can get any food that they would like to, we all pretty much expect that it would be pizza and candy and ice cream and French fries and nothing else. Right. But what's actually happens is depending on where items are placed in the line determines whether they're chosen or not. So if you take desserts and put them at the front of the line, they're 25% more likely to be chosen. If you put them at the end of the line or in a completely separate line, they're 25% less likely to be chosen. And whatever's at eye level is more likely to be chosen, whether it's French fries or carrot sticks. And so the choice, kids will make better choices, and adults as well, if you kind of stack the good things at the beginning and put those at eye level, and the other things are there, they still have a choice. And whatever child wanted to just get ice cream and candy bars could still do that. But we're helping to make choices that are to the best of our ability, we know to be better for most people.
It's what you're talking about is always thought about in terms of sales. But actually, and it's very logical because that you're trying to persuade someone to buy something or to buy a service. But it equally applies in other contexts as well. And I find it every time I speak to people that come on the sales side, I just go, well, we can just redeploy that within organizations. Have you looked at much in terms of sort of looking internally within organizations rather than externally? Because obviously the conversation usually begins with clients. How do you get your clients to do certain things? Have you looked at much about internal use?
Yes. And so I have an episode on change management, and I've done several presentations in that space. And for me, that communication piece and having positive, useful communication with other people is not just when you're actually trying to sell them something. It's about this awareness and thoughtfulness across all sorts of levels. And the way that I have talked about this and what I see is very similar to what you're talking about in that. So I do a lot in the truth about pricing and pricing strategy and change management, getting someone to adhere to a policy or to take an action that you want them to on your team or whatever it is, getting people to change desks. That's an example I give a lot because I know that's something that comes up and is difficult for business, is that you're still selling and buying even though there's no money that's changing hands. And so in this way, I am selling you on the idea of a new desk and I need you to buy in without actually paying you anything. And so all those rules still apply. And there are also businesses. I interviewed someone on my podcast, the CEO of the Littery, and they're looking at ways to help people to not litter and throw all their garbage on the street, which is feels like something that would be insurmountable and difficult to change. But he's come up with this idea of turning litter into lottery tickets. And if you throw things away in the bin correctly, then you get automatically entered in to win the lottery for, €1 million, in which when you see that, then you go, hey, that litter, I'm so excited. I found something and I can throw it away now. So
Right.
Getting people to change the rules of the brain are still all the same. It's just thinking about how they might apply and where there are hundreds of different concepts going on at any different time. It's just being able to pull the right levers in the right context. And there's a lot of testing that's needed as well for any business, because what worked for business communication conversation A doesn't necessarily work in context B. So being able to test some things out, try it. And that's, I like to talk about, I have a whole episode about testing and designing your own experiments as well.
And I think that experimentation point is interesting because one of the conversations I have with people is all around, they come and say, well, what's the answer? And you go, well, I don't know, right? It could be this or it could be this. And of course, that's not a particularly palatable sales pitch because what the hell am I hiring you for if you don't know what the answer is? and it takes time to explain that. I mean, luckily, a lot of the people that I work with, what they are doing is so when you, and it's not because they're idiots, it's just because of the way they've always done things. The methods used are, once you start to understand how science works, is they're so ineffective that you could change, almost anything would be better than the way they're doing it.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes you don't need to optimize, right? It's certain compliance topics, for example, that I focus on. You don't need 100% of people. You just need the majority of people. And if you've got 10% compliance, you can get that up to 70. That is not a bad increase for very little effort. You're never going to get that piece. But there is something interesting about the experimentation piece and cultural differences around, what works and what doesn't, and context, and I think there's generational differences. And so I find that really intriguing. But a lot of the things you're talking around in businesses are trying to catch everybody. How do you sort of see that in terms of the challenges of target audience? Shops is a good example. You walk in, targeting different people in different ways is ideally you would micro target in a way that Amazon can, but that's quite challenging in the real world. How do you see that?
I was actually just working with a school here in the States, and we were talking about, working on a project of increasing enrollment. And so when you're looking to increase enrollment, and this is a private school, and so they're also needing people to pay tuition. So for primary school, things like that. And when you approach that problem as a business, what I see a lot is also this. So the anchoring, the same concept we were talking about with the 18 Snickers bars, you end up that in a business context in all sorts of areas is that you're asking the wrong question and you're focusing on the wrong number, the wrong anchor, the wrong thing. And so for them, they were talking about, there are 100,000 people that are eligible to join and be part of the school. And so we have to figure, how are we going to talk to all of them? And then if you're thinking about how you're going to properly target 100,000 people when you have a small budget, you kind of go, ugh, that's hard for anybody, right? That's a lot of work. But instead, flipping and looking at the other side, we're saying, so how many kids are we talking? Like, what do we want to boost enrollment by? And it's like 50 people. And so, okay, if we want 50 kids, then we need to get maybe 100 people to book a tour. And where's the best place? Because they have a good conversion rate there. And so where's the best place to find 100 people and just get them in for a tour that might be a good fit? And that is a much easier problem to tackle and challenge. So that's looking at this flipping of the frame. So framing is a concept in behavioral economics as well. And so if you consider just the way that you're looking at the problem might be wrong. This is also, people are much more likely to buy ground beef or turkey or whatever if it's listed as 90% fat free than if it was labeled as 10% fat, because 10% fat sounds gross and I don't want that, even though it's exactly the same thing.
Right.
And so just because it feels insurmountable in the way that you're looking at it, if you flip and change the question or the problem you're trying to solve, or just look at it from a different angle, you can have a lot more success. And then understanding, even in the case of asking for budget or the way that you feel, I've helped talk with teams about if you are trying to get people to reduce a budget and say someone had $1 million budget in whatever department and you need them to cut it down to 800,000. If you were to say, I need you to try to cut your budget by 20%, then that is something that they'll say, oh man, I can't possibly, how am I going to get there? You start to nitpick your way down and it's very difficult, and they maybe cut, 100,000 out of the budget and you don't get to where you need to be. Whereas if you say, curious to see what would you do if you only had $600,000 or $750,000, and then maybe they come in closer to that $800,000 number and they've approached it in this new way that it was in a more thoughtful, start new, what would you do? It can have much better results and get closer to the numbers you need, maybe even under the budget you're trying to get into, and everybody feels better about the entire experience.
Right. And that's I love this stuff, and I love the flipping things on its head. Reminds me of the trick at school. I was always taught a trick, if you get asked an exam question and you don't know the answer, is answer the question you wish you'd been asked and kind of frame it as if you're answering the actual question.
PR thing, right, too, yeah.
And PR politicians use that quite a bit. It's like, I'm here to talk about X, and you'll be able, I just asked you about Y, and they kind of still continue on. And somehow, if you're the smart ones, kind of bring it around as if to sound like you've answered the question. And I think there's something really interesting in all those examples, which is the questioner or the person trying to answer the challenge always starts from their own perspective, right? And it's sort of, this is what we are trying to do. And so what we need to do is we need to kind of solve the problem as I see it. And of course, if you were thinking in terms of the target audience already, you probably wouldn't have the problem. The issue is you're not thinking in their pieces. And so the school, I thought, was a really, really sort of interesting example. You kind of go, this is not about persuading people that have already decided to buy the product, because they've already decided to buy the product. And if they're persuaded by it and they haven't already bought it, then the impediment isn't their realization that it's a good thing. Their impediment might be financial or something else. So at which point you've got levers there. But it's about going out and finding people that wouldn't have thought about it. And so kind of not preaching to the choir, but preaching to the unconverted and trying to see stuff through their particular perspective. And then, when you talk about the budget piece, I was thinking about, the number of times where we need to answer this question corporately. So I'm going to ask you the question in a way that's organizationally convenient. And you kind of go, well, that's attacking my world. Why, and you're right, if you just ask it slightly differently, but that seems lost on a lot of people. It seems really obvious that if I was going to a country where I didn't speak their language, and I do see British people in particular doing this, right? So shout a bit louder in English is not the right answer. Find a way, find a way to communicate. I don't know, use sign language or pictures, or there's ways that you can communicate, but you wouldn't dream of doing it in that context. And yet we don't think about that when we're having cognitive processes where we are speaking the same language, but we're not talking on the same terms. And I think this is a really obvious point that's missed by so many people.
Right. That, especially where we get into jargon and things like that, and the way we've always done things in business, that truly your customer base is not fluent in the language that you are speaking. They don't understand all the background. And so being able to pick out and understand what someone needs to hear at the right moment, whether that is peer that you're working with in a different department, or that is one of your staff members that doesn't know about the bigger executive team process that you've been working and planning on for months, and you're just kind of springing it on them, or into a customer base that you're encouraging to buy the next thing or get to know you and be interested in working with you in the future. You need to be thinking about it from their perspective and understanding not just what you would do if you were them, because you have additional knowledge, so you're not them,
right,
but trying to then think about, like I've worked with clients that are selling items in grocery stores. And so inside of a grocery store context, and if you're doing a test, even for a very large company, you feel, we set up the test mock grocery store and we have people go in and we give them a list of things and see what they do. And so a person walking alone when there's no one else in the grocery store and they don't have kids pulling on their legs, and it's not that they have to get somewhere, they have unlimited time and a perfect list in front of them, is absolutely not the mindset that someone is going to actually be in when they're shopping. So well-intentioned, great, but that is the space that their brain is in, that cognitive load that's stressing them out if they're trying to remember a list or working on something. If you can't replicate that mindset and that place that they're in, it will not have the same results as real life, no matter how much you want it to. But you can do this even if you I'm a big fan of Einstein, as most people are. But if you were to go in this, thinking about where he did almost everything in thought experiments. And so if Einstein was able to come up with all these amazing things and understand how the world worked through thought experiments and just taking that one step further and what if this and what if that, if we think about, if that was me and I knew nothing about this and I was walking in and I was looking at this website for the first time, would I know what I'm supposed to do? Would I know where I'm supposed to go? Does it feel logical from the ad that I clicked on to come to this page that I know what the next step is? Or am I kind of going, what? Like, where's the information in this internal email or whatever it is? So trying to do your own thought experiments and just, again, be thoughtful and take that step back and try to, walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
You reminded me, I don't know if you've seen the movie Sully, which is, the guy who landed the plane on the River Hudson in New York.
Yeah.
And they, so he does, they've got the trial, basically, has he done the right thing? And of course, they test it in perfect simulator conditions under no stress whatsoever and demonstrate that he could have made it to wherever. And he has to point out to them that it's not entirely the same thing when you're in a stressed out situation with limited room to, you've got a load of pressures on you. And that sort of theoretically perfect view of the world. And I see auditors doing this quite a bit, where it's kind of like, but you should have done, you should do this. And you kind of go, human beings don't operate on that basis. And my favorite one, actually, which you may have seen, there's a lovely thing, you get these customer surveys. On a scale of 1 to 10, would you recommend our product to your friends or whatever, colleagues? And there's one that somebody got asked for a Microsoft operating system, right? Would you recommend Windows whatever to you? And the guy said he just crossed it out and put, I need to explain to you that I do not have conversations with other people in which I make recommendations about operating systems, right? Really, like from a perspective of Microsoft or whoever was asking the question, right? Makes perfect. You want to know, do they like it? Do they not? Right? But it's a really dumb question. Because it's only going to be certain types of geeks that might be having those conversations. Your average customer really doesn't care and probably can't distinguish between the person that made the box and the person that made the stuff that's going on inside the box. And and I, as you were talking there, I think it's there seems to be this really strange thing that a lot of processes are just driven by convenience of the person creating it. And you see this, traveling is my favorite example. You go to some countries and you get the most idiotic questions that you get asked, which is kind of like, are you here to commit acts of terror? And you sort of just go, right?
Ooh, well, I guess you asked.
Well, yeah. So I wasn't going to tell you, but since you've asked that question, I don't want to lie on the form. And we joke about that thing. And I did hear there was one British lady who had unfortunately ticked the wrong box and found herself at the mercy of certain people who took it very, very literally, very, very seriously. I mean, you have to be slightly stupid not to fill in correctly, but and maybe under pressure, whatever. And it's easy. It's easy for me to say that. But you sort of look at those things and you just go, what are you achieving by that process apart from catching people that are either dumb or cognitively depleted, to be kind? And I think there's this idea about designing around your kind of target audience. I think, as you've articulated, it's not difficult to do. I mean, you mustn't impute what the target audience thinks, which is precisely your point. But I don't know why we don't do more of that. I mean, have you got a sense why this isn't obvious to people? Because this frustrates the hell out of me. I just look at it and go, it's kind of obvious that if you want someone to do something, it'd be a good idea to kind of see what it looks like from their perspective.
Yes, it is fascinating to see how we don't naturally get to this state. And there are a lot of biases within our brains about why. So I have an entire series on all the biases, and I did one that was about how we think about ourselves, another episode that's how we think about other people and people that aren't part of our in-group. And so whether we like it or not, our brains are programmed to think that we are smarter and more accurate and that we're doing the right things all the time and that other people are dumb. Sort of is
there's a few people in the public eye that we can point to that think like that, but yeah.
And so you get into this space, like you talked about confirmation bias. There's also all these different spaces of, one being fundamental attribution error, which is the way that, so if someone cuts you off in traffic while driving, they are just supremely a jerk and their entire aura and person is surrounded by them being the worst human being in existence. If you cut someone off, there are all these justifications as for why you needed to do that and why you're a good person and you don't normally do that, but they should just be okay with you because I'm a good person. And we do this all the time, even if you think about like being late for a meeting. And so if someone is late for the meeting or notoriously late for a meeting because they're constantly scheduling back-to-backs or whatever, and you think, ugh, Susie, she's always late for everything. She's the worst. She doesn't care about her job, blah, 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 blah. If you happen to be running late one day,
right, you
would assume everybody must know that you were busy and not a big deal and think that they don't feel that same way about you as you felt about Susie, but that's not true. That's everybody's looking at you in that same way, even though you don't see yourself there. And so our brains are set up to think that we are better and uniquely different from everybody else. But in reality, we're all kind of the same in the way that we process this information. And so just trying to understand that that's where your brain is going to go, whether you want it to or not. And it's hard to stop that. You can't say, hey, brain, we don't do this anymore. That rule that has been genetically wired into me for,
I will switch that
generations. We're not doing that anymore. So that doesn't work, but you can be more aware of it when it comes up. And even if it's your initial reaction to go, ugh, she's late again, that you think, okay, how would I want people to think about me if I were late, and just try to be a little bit more relaxed about the whole situation. So,
and it's funny when you talk like that, because that made me think of like Spotify and Netflix and stuff. And when the algorithm recommends something I like or that I think is cool, right, that is worthy of being recommended to me, I get very excited. I go, this is perfect. This is good.
Right.
And it recommends something that probably, right, based on my tastes, is probably, but it's embarrassing. I don't know, like it throws a Justin Bieber or something into my thing. This has not happened for the avoidance of doubt, right? Other embarrassing things.
You know nothing, right. Spotify. You are the worst.
This algorithm sucks. This is terrible. I'm going to complain. And I remember reading somewhere that they're very careful around some of these things where people blame they kind of pretend that they're prepared to accept that the algorithm occasionally quote unquote gets things wrong. And there was that you must have heard that story about the guy in Target who walked in to complain about his. So his daughter had received a mail shot basically with a load of stuff for basically pregnant women. And he complained about it and sort of said, this is outrageous. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it turned out the algorithm knew far more than he did and he had to apologize.
Yes.
And I think that's a really interesting thing, which is we're now being massively exposed by the machines because there's nowhere to hide. And it's what I call the truth serum of search. You can pretend who you are to other people, right? But if you want to get the most out of Google, you have to tell the truth. There's no point in putting in sort of, BS search terms because you won't get what you want. And I think this is a really interesting development now where we're having to sort of to engage with the machines. There's a little bit of truth being exposed about these processes.
Right. And understanding, AI and machine learning and all of that is so interesting in that. So I've seen some studies now where the machines are able to learn the biases of your specific organization now, and then is able to help you either learn something about the way that how you are biased in a way that maybe you should or shouldn't be. You know, it's just like starting to get some of this capacity, but also helping, I think, for people when you truly understand how a machine would learn and how the rules apply. I saw something that was about this kind of like hide and seek game that had machine learning, and it was like team red versus team blue, and how it was like trying to trap the other people. It was just this amazing video to watch. It was like the little people were creating blockades and all the things they were doing to break the rules and learn how, where they had, you know, millions of tries to adjust. But the way that it would adapt and learn in a way that, and it thinks so creatively in its understanding of all of the rules, that I think that's kind of what I hope to be able to help just a tiny bit in understanding. You know, our brains have the capacity to do those sorts of things, and they do have rules that they're using. And so when you understand the rules, it's much easier to win at any game. And if you have the deeper understanding, the deeper your understanding of the rules, the easier it is to win. And knowing that, you know, it is a team game in a lot of ways, but in your own business and how you're thinking about what is actually a rule and something that has to be done, and what just is the way everyone else is doing it, and knowing that you don't have to abide by those things if you don't want to. In many cases, some things are actual rules, right? But just because everybody else has always done it in a physical space, like bookstores, then if you think, no, this could be digital and nobody else gets it yet, you know, eventually you become Amazon and yay for you.
Or you disappear from the face of the earth and nobody ever hears from you again because the idea was so bad. But you'll only find that out, right? Yeah. But I think there's an interesting point you made there around rules, because I you know, when I look at this stuff, I still think organizations we tend to talk about the rules as if they're all the same thing, and they're not. There's you know, the same with laws, right? Some things are strictly enforced because it's necessary to strictly enforce them. Other things, you know, there's a bit of slack there, and then, you know, there's other rules. And in London, we have loads, right? You go back to the 1600s, and there's rules about what animals you can drive over which bridges, and who's allowed to, and there's, you know, there's certain things you're allowed to do on a Sunday that you can't, that serve no purpose whatsoever, that are not enforced, right? And even if you try to exert your right, but they still exist as rules in the book. And I think organizations often kind of, we have a rule book and we have zero tolerance. They talk in these terms, and you kind of go, we all know that there's a degree, you know, murder is not the same as overstaying in a parking bay for 5 minutes, right? And so there's already these parameters where we just know these things. And yet we sort of, I think organizations often like to pretend that all the rules that are the same. And I would say, you know, when you talk about, I know you were talking about rules as in the way we do work as much as the actual, but I would say, like, if there's a rule that's been written in the organization that everybody is breaking, or a large number of people breaking, then you have to do something about that. And chances are it may well be actually that the thing you need to do is change the rule, not to go get rid of the people, because you've designed something that is dumb. It's either dumb because it's ineffective, right? Or it's dumb because it's stopping something legitimate from happening. And I just see so many examples of kind of, we have a rule book and we will control behavior with the rule book. And you go, well, yeah, but, you know, and we've got lots of breaches of this policy, so we need to reprogram the people. And it's the rule that's the thing but that's the last thing people look at. They look at the people. We have a people problem. And it's a rules problem. And I think in the example you gave about, you know, the way we do things, I was talking to someone the other day, and he sort of said, you know, you get the kind of, we tried that in 1982 and it didn't work type argument. Right?
Yep. And the environment is exactly the same.
Nothing has changed at all since then. And of course, you know, it's sort of like just because you didn't make it work doesn't mean we couldn't make it work, even if the environment had maintained the same.
Right.
And I think there's something interesting about company cultures, and I'm really struck by this move to encourage, you know, constructive rebellion and challenging and asking questions and challenging orthodoxy, because I think as we see, you know, particularly with some of the events that are going on at the moment, is we're discovering that traditional processes and ways of thinking are not necessarily fit for purpose for the challenges we're facing.
Right. That's actually one of the things I do with a lot of businesses is helping and train on this shift from brainstorming, which is not well aligned with the way our brains actually work, to question storming. And I first heard about that in the book, A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger, which is one of my all-time favorites and I highly recommend. But it is looking at this process of, again, if you're answering, it's really easy to come up with the right answer to the wrong question. And if you're stuck in this space of, we're solving the problem is that, nobody wants to buy our product, or there's no market for X or whatever. It doesn't necessarily, it's not true just because we can't do it this way because it didn't work in 1982. If you then change something into a statement and you're generating a lot of questions, you can find a much more useful thing to be looking into that might be slightly just adjacent to what you thought the problem was, but is actually more valuable and helping to solve the right problem and get you out of your own space. Where if you're trying to come up with the answer, that's also the problem, is that, our schools and things have been training that there's a perfect answer and a right answer to everything. And if you ask a question, you are, bucking authority and you're a problem kid or whatever it is. And that is living out in a lot of businesses as well. And teaching people that there's always a right answer and there's only one and you have to be finding it and every question has the right answer is just not true. There's a lot more value in asking a bunch of thoughtful questions and knowing you don't have to answer them all. And often answering a question is just an exercise in getting to the right one. And then you can work on that problem that's a real thing and that you're interested and passionate in. It helps the team be excited about the project in a way that they wouldn't have been otherwise. It's just so much more valuable than trying to answer a question that nobody actually cares about and that isn't really a problem and isn't going to help your business anyway.
As a sort of closeout, thank you for being part of adult education, which I think should have been part of childhood education. And I will conclude, and I think people will have realized this by listening, that if we had more teachers like you in the real world, then we'd have kids growing up with kind of the right kind of ways of thinking about things. So firstly, thank you from me for providing some really entertaining listening. But thank you also for appearing on this podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Melina for appearing and to you for listening. If you want to find out more about the Brainy Business Podcast, you'll find links to that in the show notes. Highly recommended listening. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. If you could leave a review for the show, that would be hugely helpful. It helps maintain the profile, allows me to continue to attract high quality guests, and lets other people find the show as well. I'll be releasing further episodes of the podcast very soon. I'm doing more of them in this lockdown period, so look out for those on this channel. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.